During the Christmas season, I traveled by car from northern Washington to southern Utah to spend a few days with my family. I booked an Airbnb along the way for the road vacation. I wasn't searching for anything exceptional. All I really needed was a place to sleep. Thus, I discovered the most affordable location in the middle of Idaho. It was barely a mile off the highway, so it was ideal for what I needed it for, even though it was kind of in the middle of nowhere and far from any towns or cities. I departed early in the morning and began to approach as the sun was setting. The region of Idaho I was in was covered in forest and seemed quite desolate. There aren't many homes or other locations nearby, except from, I suppose, the Airbnb. My phone instructed me to stop on a tiny dirt lane after I had been traveling down the highway for some time. There were no lighting or other signs that a trail existed at all. Until I reached the cabin, I drove cautiously and gently down this dirt road for the full mile. Additionally, it appeared much larger than I had anticipated at first. The listing stated that there were no photos of the outside. It was a cabin with just one bedroom, so I anticipated something modest. I parked just in front of the vehicle. The entire forest surrounding the cabin was dark and dense. I could hear all the birds and animals shouting out as the night was coming in. I headed up to the door and literally about had a heart attack when the door abruptly opened. "I didn't mean to frighten you," the man replied, grinning broadly and speaking in an excessively warm tone. I was still getting over the fear and didn't know who this person was or why he was here at all. He clarified he was Charlie, the Airbnb's owner. He could probably still see that I didn't get it. "Your room is right over here," he said at that point. And I realized what this was. The cabin's room, not the entire cabin, was the Airbnb. I was shocked that I had committed such an error. I was certain that it did not specify that it was a common living area. However, at the time and under duress, I reasoned that everything made sense because the photos didn't show the outside and it stated that it was a single room. Charlie and I went inside. He guided me all the way to the cabin's farthest room along the lengthy corridor. It was really dark in the hallway. It had no lamps, ceiling lights, or other fixtures. Charlie grinned broadly and said, "Enjoy," after giving me a key to both my room and the cabin, leaving me to get comfortable. I threw my bag on the bed and shut the door. Although it was an Airbnb, I wasn't at all at ease with a stranger in a remote cabin. Surely that was fine. And the sole explanation, since I was just there for one night, I made the decision to stick with it and stay. I intended to relax in the hotel, sleep, and go as soon as I woke up. I made an effort not to overthink things. I started unpacking the few items I would need for the evening after unzipping my suitcase. Charlie knocked on the door of the room after a few minutes. I never heard his footsteps coming down the corridor, so I jumped once again. He seems to have merely stood there. I approached and opened it. His broad, vacant smile was starting to sound incredibly unsettling, and his fake, too amiable voice only made it worse. "How do I like the room?" he asked. In an attempt to be polite and keep the talk brief, I simply remarked that it was fantastic. He gave me a nod and instructed me to call out if I needed anything further. This time, I hesitated for a moment before saying thank you and shutting the door. After an unsettlingly lengthy period of inactivity, I eventually heard the man's footsteps leave and continue down the corridor. I secured the door. I felt incredibly uneasy about that guy for some reason. I was aware that he might have been making a great effort to be kind and a good host, but it seemed phony and somewhat unsettling. To make sure Charlie wasn't acting strangely, I spent 30 minutes in the bedroom, using my phone and listening to the cabin. After a while, I could hear the muted sound of the TV in the living room beginning to play. And so, gradually, I felt good enough to start getting ready for bed. I washed my teeth, put my phone on the nightstand to charge, and had a shower. It was one of those vintage tub showers that appeared really repulsive. However, the shower curtain was one of those hazy, somewhat transparent ones that appeared to be quite new. I tried to be quick when I switched on the water, but a minute or so later, I heard a faint thump coming from someplace in the corridor outside the bedroom. I pulled myself out of the water and made an effort to pay attention. For a brief while, I thought I saw something, perhaps a shadow moving in the bedroom, but I didn't hear anything else. I opened it as soon as I spotted it through the hazy veil and peered out, but I saw nothing. After a minute of staring and waiting, I hurriedly finished washing off, got out, and put on some clothes. Naturally, as soon as I entered the room again, I turned to face the door from which I had heard the sound. When I saw that the bedroom door was partially open, I felt my heart race. It wasn't completely open, but since I knew I had locked it, it certainly didn't matter. After a moment of immobility, I hurried over, slammed it shut, and locked it once again. Something was severely wrong with this cabin, and I had completely lost my sense of security. Not with Charlie unlocking doors in that manner. Even just thinking about that stranger strolling in with his weird smile while I was showering gave me chills. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and opened the Airbnb app to view the listing while I attempted to think of what to do. I wanted to find out if anyone else had mentioned odd behavior in their ratings. There were only 3 additional reviews, all of which gave it 5 stars. But when rereading them, they appeared to be entirely fraudulent. Even more disturbing was the realization that I hadn't made a mistake at all. According to the listing, it was a standalone cabin rather than a room in a shared living space. It didn't add up. Or I suppose everything was coming together in the most unnerving way. I had to get out of there. After packing the few items I had in my suitcase, I approached the door and pressed my ear to it in an attempt to hear Charlie's location and determine whether I could leave quickly without attracting notice. From the living room, which I knew was directly near to the front door, I could still hear the muffled TV. However, I began to hear something different as I stood silently. There was a gentle sound emanating from the room I was in. From the exact location of the bedroom wardrobe, I heard this raspy, low breathing. I flung open the bedroom door and ran out of there. I hurried past the empty living room and straight out to my car. Until I reached the freeway, I drove recklessly fast down the rough dirt road. And my mother persuaded me to file a police report after I called her in a panic. I did, but let's just say nothing came of it, so I'll spare you all the irrelevant details. His unsettling, eerie behavior was not verifiable. His improper listing of the cabin on Airbnb was the only thing that really put him in trouble. Charlie wasn't even his name, which only served to heighten the eerie atmosphere. Fortunately, the listing was taken down due to fraudulent advertising, and I never witnessed it being relisted. Hopefully, this won't happen to anyone else. What would have occurred if I hadn't left the cabin that evening is beyond comprehension. A few years ago was this. I was 23. I wanted a stress-free vacation, so I rented this cabin. I got a great rate because it was early winter, around 2 weeks after Christmas, which is probably off-season for these kinds of cabins. The first thing I noticed when I got there was how quiet everything was. The absence of sounds is first somewhat unsettling if you haven't visited a remote cabin or location in the woods in a long time. Serene, but also a little frightening, serving as a reminder of how isolated you really are. In any case, the cabin itself was much like the photos. It was basic, a touch worn out, but generally comfortable. I quickly prepared dinner, carefully unloaded, and spent reading beside the fireplace at night. That evening, nothing occurred. I simply went to bed and felt fantastic when I woke up. I made coffee and breakfast in the morning and spent the entire morning and a small portion of the afternoon indoors before growing a little bored. When I arrived, I saw that the owner had put a crude map of a trail behind the cabin by the front door. I therefore thought that now would be a good time to investigate. The owner described it as a straightforward walking trail, and it appeared to be only a few miles away. I grabbed my jacket and went out. It was immediately apparent that this was not a pleasant, well-kept trail. The owner may have made it a few years ago and never touched it again, in my opinion. It was difficult to track because it was mostly overgrown. Strangely, the map in the cabin only depicted one trail, basically a loop through the forest. However, I discovered a different road that diverged from it halfway down. Curiosity overcame me, and I went to investigate, even though I couldn't see anything in the distance along that direction. In any case, I had nothing better to do. I saw nothing for the first 5 minutes or so. I have no idea how the path was created or what it might have been used for. However, I eventually encountered a stretch of the path that was heavily covered in brush. I eventually discovered what was at the end, after persevering through it. Another cabin was present. It was ancient and decaying, with moss growing on the sides, and so run down that it was obvious it had not been maintained in decades. I had never seen a cabin as eerie as this one. Not to mention that it's in the middle of the woods. It was even more unsettling, because it was so far from the place I was staying. I approached it and looked into the opening, which was devoid of the actual door. It was entirely in ruins and smelt like mildew and rot on the inside, just like it did on the outside. The entire space was covered in dust. However, the most peculiar thing I noticed was a line of footprints on the floor, which resembled scuffs on the wood and in the dust that hadn't yet disappeared, suggesting that someone had been there not too long ago. My first idea was that perhaps someone who had previously rented the cabin had also discovered this location. However, as I was considering it, something moved out of my line of sight. I noticed a dark doorway that was open when I looked. There were no windows or lights, and the chamber was as black as it was. Beyond the threshold it appeared to be a dark emptiness. I was positive that I saw something move there, even if it was only in the corner of my eye. In a state of fear, I simply rushed back to the trail and kept going until I reached the rental cottage. I couldn't shake the nearly unbearable impression that something terrible had occurred or was occurring in that cabin. I'm not sure. However, I had a strong gut feeling that I was not going back there. I tried to unwind by locking myself in the cabin. Probably nothing would come of it, I thought myself. I informed the rental's owner about the ancient cabin I discovered there, in the hopes that he would reassure me that it was merely an abandoned location on his property, and that there was nothing to be concerned about. When he texted me back an hour later, I found it odd. There were no other cabins in the woods close by, he said in a single line. I had just told him that I had discovered a cabin back there, so I wasn't sure how to react to that. No other cabins were present. He seemed to be gaslighting me, as if he didn't trust me, or didn't want me to know anything about the cabin I discovered. In the end, I said nothing more to him. I was able to relax back down and virtually forget about that other cabin for the remainder of the afternoon and into the night. I believe that in the end, I was able to persuade myself that it was merely a forgotten, empty, and abandoned location. No less, no more. I cooked dinner, sat by the fireside, and had a few drinks. I knew I was staying up quite late, so it was probably around 11. And truly, like out of nowhere, that feeling came back. My stomach constricted, and I felt that terrible, painful sensation inside of me once more. It was really sudden. I got up from the couch and looked around, but all was quiet and dark. I stood up and peered out the window, wondering if I had heard something unintentionally. There was complete silence in the woods. Not moving, no noises. Even the trees were unmoving and utterly still. It was unnerving how serene it appeared outside. I was not accustomed to feeling paranoid. To be honest, I may have felt that way for the first and only time in my life. I gazed out the window to the rough trail beyond the cabin's dark entrance. I waited for 5 minutes before hearing something. Just outside the cabin, a few leaves crunch or sticks shatter. There was a person strolling around. I moved in the direction of the sounds. Front entrance. The sound of someone stepping onto the porch and approaching the door was barely audible to me. After that, there was silence. After 30 seconds, I hurriedly got my phone out, and for some reason, instead of calling the police, I texted the owner, informing him someone was outside the cabin right now and asking if he knew who it was, or if someone was meant to be here. Why I didn't just be cautious and call the cops first is beyond me. I believe that calling the police to someone else's cottage felt strange. However, unsettlingly, as soon as I sent the text, just outside the cabin's front door, I heard a phone chime. Instantly, my intuition grew worse. The owner was outside. But why in the world was he there? And why didn't he send me a text first? He was just standing there. Why? All of this wasn't quite right. And I had a sneaking suspicion that all of this had something to do with the abandoned cabin out there. He didn't text me back, even after I heard his phone chime. I made a 911 call. A few minutes after I received the confirmation, knowing he was still there outside that door, I merely stayed motionless in the eerie silence after hanging up the phone with the cops. Knowing that he must have had a key to the cabin, and could just enter if he so desired, was my greatest dread. But he didn't. For whatever reason, he seemed to be out there discussing whether or not to take action. After a while, I heard some thumps on the porch, but after that, nothing happened until the police showed up. I showed them the messages on my phone and told them everything. They went straight to the owner's main address to speak with him, and he wasn't present. Didn't answer his phone or the door. All of this made sense if he was outside the cabin, since he couldn't have traveled very far by simply strolling through the forest. When they eventually managed to get him to speak over the course of the following few days, he continued to deny everything, claimed he had no idea what I was talking about, and wasn't even at the cabin. The cops concurred that everything was extremely suspicious, and that he appeared to be planning something. Or maybe that cabin I found had something he was hiding. However, the police were essentially powerless without a search warrant, and without any solid proof of anything. I don't know what was happening there. I believe that things could have been much worse if I had tried to delve a little deeper into what was within that cabin. Perhaps this was partly my fault for going farther than I should have. I lived in what you'd call your normal cabin in the woods. It was mostly simply a cozy, peaceful location, about 30 minutes from town, give or take. In the 8 years I had lived there before to this, I had never seen or even heard anyone nearby, because it was so far away from anything. My cabin. I essentially had nothing to do today. I also took a stroll around my property at some time in the morning. I knew it well enough to not need a trail or anything. I was enjoying the outdoors and trekking among the trees when I happened upon something that seemed really strange right away. I discovered the remains of a campsite, a burned-out pile of ashes from a bonfire, and a level spot where what appeared to be a tent had been built up, approximately 300 or 400 feet from the rear of my cabin. I could see my cabin amid all the trees as I stood in the center of the campground. It was that close. They couldn't have believed they weren't on someone's property, whomever they were. It seemed as though they were destined to be. I continued to move about, searching for any more indications that someone might be there, but I was unsuccessful. It was only that one place. I'm not sure how I missed those. After spending so many years by myself in the cabin, I believe I simply never considered looking around. However, I saw nothing for the remainder of the day. Additionally, I looked out the windows at night and saw no clear indications of a campfire or the presence of people. The days that followed were typical. I was enjoying a drink on my back porch on a Saturday night while taking in the serene woodland when I noticed an orange glow flickering in the trees. It came from the same location where I had seen the camping, and I could tell it was a campfire because of the light. I stood up, and, perhaps against my better judgment, made my way over to confront them, or at the very least, let them know that this was my property. I was also going to make an effort to be kind about it. Let them finish camping, perhaps, the evening, in order to avoid any problems and maintain a cordial exchange. Save when I approached, I could hardly see anything, save the warm glow of the bonfire. So I really should have gotten a torch first. And when I came to the campsite, it was deserted. There was nobody present, just a tent next to a fire that burns in the middle of the trees. There had to have been someone here a few minutes prior, which led me to believe that they were probably keeping an eye on me, and witnessed me leaving the campsite and hiding before I arrived. I began to take a closer look around, frantically, but there were shadows everywhere amongst the trees. I was unable to see anyone if they were out there. After a minute, I began to rush back to my cabin, because being outside was becoming too stressful and uncomfortable. I wanted to grab my phone and make a police call. I reasoned that even if the man fled, they might be able to do some research and discover his identity and motivation. However, I came to a stop in the midst of the field between my cabin and the trees. I had my front door open. I understood that whatever was out here had broken into my cabin when I was at the camping. I was appalled to realize that I had been duped or dragged out and had nowhere to truly go. I was unable to rush for aid, hide in my cabin, or call the police. I was stuck in the middle of the field and didn't know what to do. There was nowhere to flee after all. I needed my car keys or my phone. As I cautiously approached the cabin, I saw that all of the lights had been turned off. Inside, it was pitch black. I approached the front door and looked inside, but saw no movement. Who's inside? I listened for a few seconds, but I didn't hear anything. So I moved in a few steps. Every sense in my body was heightened by the excitement, and my own heartbeat seemed to be so loud. On the end table by the kitchen, my phone was farther away than my car keys. I chose to just grab my car keys, since I'm very certain I left my phone in the bedroom on the other side of the cottage. I mustered the bravery and hurried over to seize them. When I approached the table, I noticed something in the kitchen. Someone was observing me from a murky, dark corner of the kitchen. I heard his heavy footsteps rushing up after me as I sprinted back toward the front entrance. I quickly got inside my car after slamming the door to buy myself some time. The dude didn't give up at all, continuously rushing toward me as I turned the car on and started backing out. I had to perform a three-point turn, and he caught up just enough to grip one of the door handles and open it slightly before I pulled away. In a matter of milliseconds, I managed to escape before he could enter. I made the entire drive to the town's police station. I couldn't stop thinking about how close we were, and that the man was still at my cabin during the entire drive. He could be doing anything, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. And it's clear that I was experiencing anxiousness the entire time I was waiting at the police station for information about the officers they dispatched to do the investigation. And when one of the cops informed me that someone had tried to set my cabin on fire, I nearly lost my mind. They discovered the fireplace blazing with a pile of wood that filled the entire living room. It's amazing that neither the ceiling nor the floors caught fire, and the cops there managed to contain it long enough for the fire service to put an end to it. The ashes at his campground were the only trace of the man. He was nowhere to be found, along with everything else. Knowing that he was attempting to hurt me and had likely been stalking me for days or weeks while keeping an eye on my cabin from the woods, made the entire situation much more terrifying. Furthermore, I had no idea who he was or why he was acting in this way. After that, I had movers pack and relocate everything to a new location far from my cabin, so I didn't spend a single night there. After that, the crime investigation continued for months, but in the absence of fresh leads, it never produced much, and eventually came to an end. I doubt I'll ever find out what was in store for me, or how horrible things could have become in that cabin.